Like I mentioned in the intro episode, it's necessary that we challenge our perspective of what lead guitar can be. Most of the guitar heroes of the past century were known for their technicality and flash and spectacle. And while the music that they made was oriented around those qualities, most of the lead guitar parts in the songs that you and I love possess none of them. Instead, they're shooting just to make the song better, and that changes the way that they're formed. We're gonna dig into that more in this episode. Okay, but first, a quick history lesson. I promise this is important. For thousands of years, cultures all over the world, but particularly in Western Europe, used a 7-note musical alphabet, and since the 16th century, it became common to divide what they called an octave, the distance between two pitches that are double or half the frequency of one another, into 12 equal parts. Let's start with that 7-note alphabet. We'll use our guitar's A string since it starts on A. The notes A, B, C, D, E, F, G can be found on the open string, the 2nd fret, the 3rd fret, the 5th fret, the 7th fret, the 8th fret, the 10th fret, and then the 12th fret brings us back to A. You might have noticed that all of those notes had a fret in between them except for B and C and E and F. Now that's important because apart from those two pairs of exceptions, all the other notes have tweener notes on either side of them that we name using sharps and flats relative to the notes that they're next to. For example, the note on the 6th fret of the A string, we could call D sharp because it's a little bit higher than D, or E flat because it's a little bit lower than E. Now, whether we use a sharp or a flat to name a note is sometimes arbitrary and sometimes based on musical decisions that we've already made, but for now, I just want us to remember that these notes exist. This musical alphabet repeats itself all over the guitar's fretboard, but because of how the instrument is taught, many players will only really be familiar with some of the notes on the low E string and maybe some on the A string. But we can use the concept of octaves to map a lot of the rest of the fretboard. Here's how it works. If your starting note is on the E string or the A string, your octave, the note that's twice the pitch, is going to be 2 strings thinner and 2 frets closer to the body of the guitar. For example, the note G on the 3rd fret of the low E string finds its octave 2 strings thinner and 2 frets closer to the body on the 5th fret of the D string. There you go. I don't know where you thought lead guitar ideas were going to come from, but the first stop on our journey is the song Chasing Cars by the band Snow Patrol. Now, normally this song is in the key of A and uses these shapes. But we can use our octave-based method to move this part to the key of C, and so that first shape would start on the 10th fret instead of the 7th. We're using the key of C because its lack of sharps and flats makes it a lot easier to talk about. Believe it or not, even though the chords underneath it might change, this shape is all we need to create a workable lead guitar part. You already know this sound because it's what's going on the G and B strings of the worship leader G chords that you already know. Check it out. So that's it. 1 2-string shape and you've got a workable part. But let's say that you wanted this part to stick out a little bit more from the underlying harmony. No worries. We'll just take the lower of the 2 notes and bump it up an octave in a process that we call inverting a chord. So if we started with the 10th fret of the D string and the 12th fret of the G string, we'll end up with the 12th fret of the G string and the 13th fret of the B string, like so. You already know this sound because it's what the B and high E strings are doing in your worship leader G chords. Here it is in action. You can already hear that this part sounds good without any movement or changing notes at all, but you might be asking, Ian, this doesn't really feel like lead guitar. Shouldn't I be changing notes more? Why won't you let me change notes, Ian? And that's totally fair. We know that this part sounds good without any changes in its static form, but we usually want lead guitar to be a little bit more complicated, more complex, more nuanced. That's okay, and this shape gives us options. Let's say we're starting with that root position version at the 10th fret of the D string. We can move the lower note 1/2 step back or 1 whole step ahead. Or we can take the higher note and move it a whole step back. In the inverted shape, all of the movement on the D string will get transported up to the B string. But because of how our fingers are oriented, it ends up being a little bit easier to exchange the note on the G string for the one that's a whole step ahead instead of a whole step back. Here's how movement adds a little bit of flavor to this part. Obviously, there are technical explanations for what's going on here, and we're going to get into some of those later on in this series. But for now, go ahead and start trying out all these different combinations of notes with the chord progressions that you're already playing, and trust yourself to pick out the combinations that sound the best to you. Remember, you can find over 30 pages of PDF accompaniment as well as backing tracks and a way to book a lesson with me at the link in this video's description. I'll see you next time.